Chapter 1. The Breaking Point. I stood in the empty boardroom at 11:47 p.m., staring at the resignation letters scattered across the mahogany table like fallen leaves after a storm. 7 of my best people had quit in the span of 2 weeks, and their words echoed in my head with the persistence of a funeral bell. Toxic leadership, micromanagement, lost faith in the vision. The irony wasn't lost on me. 6 months earlier, I'd been promoted to Regional Director of Operations at Mitchell & Associates, the consulting firm where I'd climbed the ladder for 8 grueling years. I'd finally made it. Corner office, 6-figure salary, a team of 35 professionals reporting to me. Everything I'd worked for since graduating from business school. But as I picked up the latest resignation letter from Sarah Chun, my former top performer, her words cut deeper than any performance review ever had. "Peter, you've become everything you once criticized. I can't work for someone who leads through fear instead of inspiration." The weight of those words settled in my chest like a stone. When had I become that kind of leader? When had the eager, collaborative team player who'd started in the mailroom transformed into someone his own people couldn't stand to work for? I thought back to my first day at Mitchell & Associates, when I was 24 and desperate to prove myself. I'd stayed late, arrived early, volunteered for every project, and treated every senior executive like they walked on water. Back then, I believed that hard work and loyalty would naturally translate into good leadership when my time came. But somewhere between the promotions and the pressure to deliver results, I'd lost sight of the person I'd been. The servant had become a tyrant, and I didn't even know when it happened. My phone buzzed with a text from my wife, "Rachel, kids asleep. Dinner's in the fridge. Hope your meeting went better than expected." I stared at the message, knowing I'd have to go home and tell her that my emergency leadership meeting had actually been damage control, trying to convince 7 people not to abandon ship. The meeting had failed spectacularly, and I was left wondering if I was even cut out to lead anyone, including myself. Standing in that empty room, surrounded by the wreckage of my leadership, I felt more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. I'd achieved everything I thought I wanted, only to discover I'd lost everything that actually mattered. Chapter 2. The Descent. The next few months became a masterclass in how not to lead a team. Desperate to stop the bleeding, I tried every leadership technique I could remember from business school, each attempt more disastrous than the last. I implemented strict performance monitoring systems, thinking structure would solve the trust problem. Instead, I created an atmosphere where people were afraid to take risks or admit mistakes. Innovation died, and my team became a collection of order takers rather than problem solvers. I tried the opposite approach, relaxing all standards and hoping that freedom would restore morale. The result was chaos. Projects missed deadlines, quality suffered, and the remaining team members felt abandoned and directionless. During one particularly brutal team meeting, I attempted to be more inspiring by delivering what I thought was a motivational speech about our quarterly goals. The room was silent except for the sound of people checking their phones and exchanging uncomfortable glances. "Any questions?" I asked, trying to project confidence I didn't feel. Marcus, one of my longest-tenured employees, finally spoke up. "Peter, can I be honest with you?" I nodded, though every instinct told me to brace for impact. "We don't understand what you want from us anymore," he said quietly. 6 months ago, you knew each of us personally. You asked about our families, our career goals, our ideas. Now it feels like you see us as productivity metrics rather than people." The room fell silent. I wanted to defend myself, to explain the pressure I was under from upper management, the impossible targets I was expected to hit. Instead, I heard myself saying, "Meeting adjourned," and watched my team file out with the resigned expressions of people who'd given up hope. That night, I found myself Googling how to be a better leader at 2 a.m., scrolling through countless articles that all seemed to say the same thing. Be authentic, inspire trust, communicate vision. Easy to say, impossible to implement when you've already lost your team's respect. The breaking point came during my quarterly review with the CEO, James Mitchell himself. He sat across from his massive desk. My performance metrics spread between us like evidence in a trial. "Peter," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 40 years in business, "your team's productivity is down 23%, client satisfaction has dropped to concerning levels, and we've lost some of our best people. What's your assessment of the situation?" I wanted to blame the market, the impossible deadlines, the unrealistic expectations. Instead, the truth tumbled out. I think I've forgotten how to lead people, sir. I know how to manage processes and hit targets, but I've lost my team somewhere along the way. Mitchell studied me for a long moment. That's the first honest thing you've said in months. The question is, what are you going to do about it? I had no answer. I tried everything I could think of, and nothing worked. I was a leader without followers, a general without an army, and I had no idea how to bridge the gap I'd created. Chapter 3. The Encounter. The answer came from an unexpected source. 2 weeks after my disastrous review, I found myself at a corporate leadership summit in Washington, D.C. A mandatory event that I'd normally have dreaded but now attended with the desperation of a drowning man reaching for anything that might keep him afloat. The keynote speaker was Congressman George Hartwell, a veteran politician known for his ability to work across party lines and build unlikely coalitions. I'd expected the typical political rhetoric, but instead, he told a story that stopped me cold. 25 years ago, Hartwell began, I was a junior staffer on Capitol Hill, making coffee and filing papers for a senator who barely knew my name. I was hungry for power, convinced that authority would solve all my problems. I thought leadership was about getting people to do what you wanted. He paused, scanning the audience. I was wrong about everything. After his speech, I approached him during the networking reception, my hand shaking slightly as I introduced myself. Congressman Hartwell, my name is Peter Simpson. I'm struggling with something you mentioned in your speech. I think I've become the kind of leader I used to hate working for, and I don't know how to fix it. Instead of offering empty platitudes, George studied me with the intensity of someone who'd seen every variation of human ambition and failure. Walk with me, he said, leading me to a quiet corner of the hotel lobby. Tell me about the last time you truly served someone else without expecting anything in return. The question caught me off guard. I thought about my recent interactions with my team, with my family, with anyone in my life. Everything felt transactional, calculated, designed to achieve some outcome I wanted. I can't remember, I admitted, the words feeling like a confession. George nodded slowly. That's your problem right there. You've forgotten that every leader was once a servant. Real leadership isn't about getting people to follow you. It's about serving them so well that they choose to walk alongside you. He told me about research conducted at Harvard Business School by Dr. Robert Greenleaf, who'd studied what he called servant leadership for over 30 years. The study followed 200 executives across multiple industries, tracking their long-term effectiveness and team satisfaction. The most successful leaders, measured not just by profit margins, but by employee retention, innovation, and sustainable growth, were those who saw their role as serving their team's success rather than commanding their obedience, George explained. He shared examples that challenged everything I thought I knew about leadership. General Colin Powell, who said his job as a leader was to serve his soldiers so they could serve their mission. Cheryl Strayed, the CEO who turned around a failing company in Toronto by spending her first 100 days asking each employee what they needed to do their best work, then moving heaven and earth to provide it. But how do you maintain authority while serving? I asked. How do you get results without demanding them? George smiled. That's the paradox that separates real leaders from managers. When you serve people authentically, when you make their success your mission, they'll move mountains for you. Not because they have to, but because they want to. He pulled out his phone and showed me data from a longitudinal study conducted across government agencies in Australia, Canada, and the UK. Teams led by servant leaders showed 47% higher engagement, 33% better performance metrics, and 60% lower turnover than traditionally managed teams. The research is clear, George said. But here's what the studies can't measure. When you lead through service, you don't just create better results. You create better people. You develop future leaders instead of permanent followers. Before we parted ways, George gave me a challenge that would change my life. For the next 90 days, I want you to run an experiment. Instead of asking, how can my team serve my goals? Ask, how can I serve my team's potential? Keep a journal of what changes and call me in 3 months. Chapter 4. The Ascent. I returned to the office on Monday with a mixture of hope and terror. The servant leadership approach felt vulnerable, risky, completely contrary to everything I've been taught about maintaining authority. But with my team already demoralized and my job hanging by a thread, I had nothing left to lose. The first step was harder than I'd expected, admitting to my team that I'd failed them. I called a team meeting for that Thursday, not to deliver another strategic presentation, but to have the most honest conversation of my professional life. I want to start by acknowledging something, I began, my voice less steady than I would have liked. Over the past 6 months, I've been so focused on proving myself as a leader that I forgot to actually lead. I've managed you instead of serving you, and I've let fear drive my decisions instead of trust. The room was uncomfortably quiet. Marcus shifted in his seat. Jennifer looked surprised. A few people exchanged glances, unsure whether this was genuine or another management strategy. I'm not asking for forgiveness, I continued. I'm asking for the chance to show you a different kind of leadership. I want to spend the next month learning how I can better serve your success, your growth, and your ability to do work that matters. I outlined George's servant leadership framework, adapted for our specific situation. Serve their growth. Instead of micromanaging tasks, I would focus on developing each person's skills and career trajectory. Serve their purpose. I would work to connect each person's role to meaningful outcomes they cared about. Serve their success. I would remove obstacles, provide resources, and advocate for them with upper management. Serve their voice. I would create space for their ideas, concerns, and feedback to shape our direction. The response was mixed. Some people seemed cautiously optimistic. Others appeared skeptical. Jennifer, one of my most experienced team members, finally spoke up. Peter, this sounds good in theory, but how do we know this isn't just another management trend you'll abandon when things get tough? It was a fair question, and I didn't have a perfect answer. You don't know, I said, but I'm hoping you'll give me the chance to prove it through actions, not words. The transformation wasn't immediate or smooth. My first attempts at servant leadership felt awkward and forced. I scheduled one-on-one meetings with each team member to ask about their career goals, their challenges, and what they needed from me to succeed. Some conversations were stilted. Others revealed frustrations I'd been completely unaware of. Marcus told me he'd been wanting to develop his project management skills, but had never felt safe expressing interest in expanding his role. Jennifer shared that she'd been considering leaving the company because she felt her analytical skills were being underutilized. For the first time in months, I stopped thinking about how to get better performance from my team and started thinking about how to help them perform at their best. I began advocating upward for my team's ideas and concerns. When upper management questioned a timeline that my team said was unrealistic, I backed their assessment instead of just passing down the pressure. When Jennifer proposed a new analytical approach that would require additional software, I fought for the budget instead of dismissing it as unnecessary. The most difficult part was learning to trust people to do excellent work without my constant oversight. I had to resist the urge to check in every few hours, to revise their approaches, to micromanage outcomes. Instead, I focused on ensuring they had clarity on objectives and the resources to achieve them. 3 weeks into the experiment, something unexpected happened. Marcus came to me with a solution to a client problem that was more creative and effective than anything I would have conceived. Jennifer started leading cross-team initiatives that improved our entire department's efficiency. But the real breakthrough came during a crisis. Our biggest client called an emergency meeting, threatening to cancel their contract due to concerns about recent project delays. The old me would have panicked, blamed my team, and tried to single-handedly save the relationship. Instead, I brought my team together and shared the situation honestly. "This is serious," I said. "I need your best thinking on how we can address their concerns and prevent this from happening again." What followed was the most collaborative problem-solving session we'd ever had. Different team members identified root causes I hadn't seen, proposed solutions that addressed the client's real concerns, and volunteered to take ownership of implementation steps. We not only saved the client relationship, we strengthened it. The client specifically mentioned being impressed by our team's unified, thoughtful response to their concerns. Chapter 5. The Integration. 90 days after my conversation with George, I called him from the same boardroom where I'd once stared at resignation letters. This time, the table was covered with project plans, innovation proposals, and thank you notes from clients. "How's the experiment going, Peter?" George asked. "It's been the hardest and most rewarding 3 months of my career," I told him honestly. "I've learned that leading through service isn't about being weak or passive. It requires more strength and courage than I ever imagined." I shared the metrics that told part of the story. Team productivity up 31%, client satisfaction scores at an all-time high, 0 resignations in 3 months. But the numbers didn't capture the transformation that mattered most. My team had evolved from order takers to innovators. They brought me ideas instead of waiting for instructions. They solved problems proactively instead of escalating everything. They collaborated naturally instead of competing destructively. Most importantly, they were developing into leaders themselves. Marcus was now mentoring new hires, sharing the same growth-focused approach I learned to take with him. Jennifer had started leading cross-departmental initiatives, demonstrating the same servant leadership principles with other teams. You've discovered something that most people in power never figure out, George said. True influence comes not from what you can make people do, but from who you help them become. He told me about a follow-up study from the Harvard research, tracking servant leaders over a decade. The teams they developed consistently outperformed others even after the original leaders moved on, creating what researchers called a culture of leadership development. That's your real legacy, George explained. Not the projects you complete or the targets you hit, but the leaders you develop. Every person you serve as a leader becomes better equipped to serve others. 6 months later, I was promoted to vice president, but not for the reasons I'd once expected. James Mitchell called me into his office again, but this time the conversation was completely different. Peter, we've been watching your team's transformation, he said. More importantly, we've been watching other departments request to work with your people. You've created something we want to replicate across the entire organization. He offered me the VP role not because I'd hit my numbers, though I had, but because I'd demonstrated the ability to develop people who could exceed their own expectations. What's your secret? He asked. I thought about George's words, about the servant leadership research, about the journey from command and control to serve and empower. I learned that every leader was once a servant, I said, and the best leaders never stop serving. A year later, I was invited to speak at the same leadership summit where I'd met George. As I stood on that stage, looking out at an audience full of ambitious, driven professionals, I shared the story of my transformation. I used to think leadership was about getting people to follow me, I told them. I learned that real leadership is about serving people so well that they become leaders themselves. I shared research from multiple countries showing the effectiveness of servant leadership, but I also shared something more personal, the realization that leading through service had made me not just a better manager, but a better husband, father, and human being. After the speech, dozens of people approached me with their own stories of leadership struggles. Each conversation reminded me of myself 18 months earlier, driven, ambitious, but fundamentally misunderstanding what it meant to lead. One young manager asked the question I'd once asked George: how do you maintain authority while serving others? I thought carefully before answering. You don't maintain authority, you earn it, every single day, by proving that your leadership serves something bigger than your own success. When people trust that you're genuinely invested in their growth, they'll follow you anywhere. Not because they have to, but because they want to see where that kind of leadership can take them. That evening, I called George to thank him for the conversation that had changed my life. You know what I'm proudest of, he said. Not that you became a better leader, but that you became a leader who creates other leaders. That's how change really happens. One person serves another, who serves another, creating ripples that spread far beyond what any individual could accomplish alone. Today, when people ask me about leadership, I tell them what George taught me. Every leader was once a servant, and the best leaders never forget it. Real power doesn't come from commanding others, it comes from empowering them. True influence isn't about creating followers, it's about developing future leaders who will carry your values and principles forward long after you're gone. The most profound lesson of my journey wasn't about management techniques or organizational strategies. It was about remember that leadership is fundamentally an act of service, service to people's potential, to shared purposes larger than ourselves, and to the belief that when we lift others up, we all rise together. In the end, I learned that being a lord isn't about ruling over subjects. It's about creating a kingdom where everyone can become royalty in their own right. That's the kind of leadership that changes not just organizations, but the world itself, one served and empowered person at a time.